For 20 years, Grandma disappeared every Sunday at exactly 3:10 p.m. Not early, not late, not once. Rain, heat, illness, birthdays, holidays, it didn't matter. At 3:10, she put on the same faded coat, checked the same old watch, and walked out the front door without explaining where she was going or when she would return. At first, no one questioned it. Adults are allowed their routines, and children are taught not to pry. But routines that survive decades stop being habits. They become secrets. When I was young, I thought Grandma's Sundays were boring. She lived with us after Grandpa died, quiet and self-contained, filling the house with the smell of tea and old books. Sundays were the only days she didn't ask anyone if they wanted something from the kitchen before leaving.
No udwie, no explanation.
Just the sound of the door closing softly behind her. She always came back before sunset, her shoes dusty, her eyes distant, like she had been somewhere far away without moving very far at all. As the years passed, the questions grew louder, even if no one asked them out loud. My parents exchanged glances every Sunday afternoon. Once, my mother joked that Grandma probably had a secret boyfriend. Grandma smiled faintly and said nothing. Another time, my father asked directly if she was visiting a friend. Grandma answered kindly but vaguely, saying she was taking care of something. That answer never changed, no matter how many times it was asked. What made it stranger wasn't that she left. It was how she returned. Every Sunday evening, she washed her hands longer than necessary, as if trying to scrub something invisible away. She sat quietly at dinner, listening more than speaking, her eyes fixed on a place only she could see. Sometimes she looked relieved. Sometimes she looked haunted. Once, when I was older, I noticed her hand shaking as she folded her coat and placed it back in the closet. When Grandma turned 70, her health began to slow her. Walking became harder. Her breath shorter.
We assumed the Sundays would stop.
They didn't. She left with a cane now, her steps careful but determined, as if whatever waited for her outside mattered more than her pain. That was when curiosity turned into concern. Where could she possibly be going that she wouldn't let anyone help her get there? The first real crack appeared the year Grandpa's old watch disappeared. Grandma had kept it in a small wooden box by her bed for as long as I could remember. One Sunday evening, the box was empty. When asked, she said she had given it to someone who needed it more. That answer sat heavy in the room. Grandpa's watch wasn't something you just gave away. It was something you guarded. Something you kept close. Years later, on a quiet Sunday when Grandma didn't come home by sunset, fear finally broke through politeness. Night fell.
Phones rang unanswered.
My father paced the living room, checking the door every few minutes. When Grandma finally returned, well after dark, her face pale and exhausted, no one scolded her. No one asked where she had been. We were just relieved she was alive. Grandma apologized softly and went straight to her room. That night, I heard her crying for the first time. She never missed another Sunday after that, but something changed. The coat grew heavier with items in its pockets.
Notes.
Small objects. Things she never explained. I noticed her marking dates in an old calendar, circling Sundays with a trembling hand. It felt like she was counting down to something, not forward. The truth didn't begin with discovery. It began with loss. The Sunday Grandma didn't leave. She sat by the window that afternoon, her coat untouched, her eyes following the clock as it ticked past 3:10. When we asked if she was feeling unwell, she shook her head and said quietly that she couldn't go anymore. She didn't say why. She didn't need to. The fear in her voice told us everything we didn't yet understand. That night, I made a decision I would later wish I had made sooner. The following Sunday, I followed her. The following Sunday, I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do. At 3:05 p.m., Grandma stood up from her chair more slowly than usual, pulled on her faded coat, and checked the same old watch she had checked for 20 years. Her hands lingered on it for a moment, almost lovingly, before she slipped it into her pocket. I stayed seated, pretending to scroll on my phone, my heart beating louder with every second. When the clock hit 3:10 and the front door closed behind her, I waited exactly 30 seconds before standing up, grabbing my jacket, and stepping outside. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the day itself knew it was about to give something away. Grandma didn't walk toward the bus stop like I had always assumed she did. Instead, she turned down a narrow side street, one we rarely used, her pace steady but cautious. I stayed far enough behind to avoid being seen, ducking behind parked cars whenever she slowed. It felt wrong, following her like this, but the pull of 20 unanswered years was stronger than guilt. As we moved farther from home, the neighborhood changed. Familiar houses gave way to older buildings, quieter streets, and finally a stretch of road that led toward the edge of town, a place most people only passed through, never stopped in. She paused once, just once, and looked over her shoulder. My heart stopped. I flattened myself against a fence, barely breathing, convinced she could hear it anyway. But she didn't see me. She adjusted her coat, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and continued walking. That was when I realized this wasn't just a routine. This was something that cost her every single time she did it. After nearly 40 minutes, Grandma turned off the road and onto a dirt path lined with overgrown grass and broken stones. At the end of it stood a small, weathered building I had never noticed before, half hidden by trees. It wasn't a church, not exactly, and not quite abandoned either. A faded sign hung crooked near the entrance, its lettering too worn to read clearly. Grandma stopped in front of it and stood still, her shoulders rising and falling as if she were gathering strength. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I watched as she knocked softly on the door, not once, but twice, the same way someone might knock on a familiar home. After a moment, the door opened just enough for a face to appear. I couldn't see it clearly, only that it belonged to someone younger than Grandma. Much younger. Grandma smiled then, a smile I had never seen before, one that was full of pain and relief at the same time. She handed over the envelope, and for a brief second, the person inside reached out and touched her hand. That was when I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't a place she visited. This was a relationship she protected. Grandma stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. I waited, crouched behind a tree, watching the building as if it might disappear if I blinked. Minutes passed. Then more. My mind raced through possibilities I wasn't ready to face. Had she been hiding another family? Paying for something she felt responsible for? Making amends for a past no one knew about? Every theory felt too small for the weight of what I had just seen. When the door finally opened again, Grandma emerged looking lighter and heavier all at once. Her eyes were red, but her posture was straighter, as if she had set something down and picked something else up in its place. She didn't leave immediately. She stood there, speaking quietly to the person inside, nodding, smiling sadly, touching her coat pocket as if checking that something important was still there. Before she turned away, she looked back at the building one last time, the way people do when they don't know if they'll be allowed to return. I followed her back at a greater distance, my thoughts tangled and loud. She walked more slowly now, leaning harder on her cane, the afternoon light stretching shadows across the road. Halfway home, she stopped suddenly. This time, I wasn't fast enough to hide. She turned around, her eyes locking onto mine with a calm that frightened me more than anger ever could. She didn't look surprised. She looked tired. "So," she said softly, her voice carrying 20 years of waiting, "you finally decided to see." She didn't ask why I followed her. She didn't tell me to go home. She just stood there, looking at me as if she had always known this moment would come, and that once it did, nothing would ever be the same again. We stood there in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Grandma didn't look angry or betrayed. She looked relieved, as if the burden of hiding had finally shifted, even if only a little. I tried to apologize, the words stumbling over each other, but she raised her hand gently and shook her head. She told me there was nothing to be sorry for, that curiosity was a form of care, and that one day I would understand why some truths waited so long to be spoken. Then she surprised me by asking me to walk with her the rest of the way home, not beside her, but slowly, in step, as if the years between us had narrowed into something manageable. As we walked, she didn't explain everything at once. She spoke in pieces, fragments of a story she had rehearsed in her head for decades, but never believed she would have to tell. She said the building I had seen was not a charity, not a church, and not a place of worship in the traditional sense. It was a refuge. A place where people who had been forgotten, abandoned, or quietly erased found temporary shelter. She told me that long before I was born, before our family felt stable and complete, she had made a choice that saved her life but shattered someone else's. The Sundays, she said, were her way of trying to balance a scale that could never truly be even. She admitted that the person inside the building was not a stranger, and not someone she had met by chance. He was connected to her by blood, though not in a way that made sense within the story our family knew. She didn't use the word son, but she didn't need to. It hung between us, heavy and undeniable. She said he had been born during a time when keeping him would have destroyed everything she had, and when giving him away felt like the only way to ensure he lived at all. She had spent years not knowing where he was, whether he was safe, whether he hated her, and then one day, many years later, she had found him again through a chain of coincidences that felt almost cruel in their timing. When she finally did, she didn't reclaim him. She didn't explain who she was. She watched from a distance, learned what kind of life he lived, what kind of man he had become. Only when his life fell apart, when he had nowhere else to go, did she step forward, not as his mother, but as someone willing to help without asking for recognition. The refuge became the place where they met, where she could support him and others like him without exposing a truth she believed would only cause pain. Every envelope she carried, every object she passed on, was a way of making sure he and the people around him had what they needed without ever knowing why. I asked her why she never told us, why she carried this alone for so long. She stopped walking then and looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of fear and love so intense it almost hurt to see. She said she was afraid that once the secret was out, it would change the way we saw her, and worse, the way we saw each other. She had built our family on stability, on certainty, and she couldn't bear the thought of being the one to fracture it. So she chose to fracture herself instead, week after week, Sunday after Sunday. By the time we reached home, the sky was beginning to darken, and Grandma looked exhausted. Before we went inside, she made me promise something. She asked me to promise that I wouldn't tell anyone yet, not until she decided the time was right. She said secrets had their own seasons, and revealing them too early could destroy the very people they were meant to protect. I agreed, even though the weight of that promise settled heavily on my chest. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something terrifying. Grandma hadn't stopped going on Sundays because she no longer cared. She had stopped because her body was failing her, and the clock she checked so faithfully was no longer counting time forward. It was counting what little she had left. The weeks that followed felt unreal, as if life had slipped slightly out of alignment and never quite settled back into place. Every Sunday at 3:10 p.m., the house grew tense in a way no one could explain. Grandma stayed inside now, sitting in her chair by the window, her coat folded neatly beside her, her eyes fixed on the street she no longer walked. I watched her closely, noticing how much effort it took for her to breathe, how the strength seemed to drain from her more quickly each day. Yet her mind remained sharp, burdened by memories she was finally preparing to release. She didn't speak often about what I had learned, but sometimes she would ask quietly if I remembered certain details from my childhood, moments that had once seemed ordinary and now felt loaded with meaning. One Sunday afternoon, she asked me to bring her the old watch she had checked so faithfully for years. When I placed it in her hand, she turned it over slowly, tracing the scratches on the back with her thumb. She told me it had belonged to her own father, and that she had once planned to give it to the child she lost, as proof that he had been wanted, loved, and never forgotten. Instead, She had given it to him years later, anonymously, when she knew he needed something valuable enough to start over but personal enough to feel seen. Hearing that, I understood that her disappearances had never been about escape. They had been about responsibility. The truth came out sooner than she planned. One evening, Grandma collapsed quietly in the kitchen, her body finally giving in after years of carrying more than it should have. In the hospital, surrounded by machines and murmured conversations, she asked for the family to be brought together. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were clear. She told them everything, not dramatically, not defensively, but honestly. The room filled with shock, confusion, and grief, but also with something unexpected: understanding. The story she shared reframed her silence, her routines, her absences, turning them into acts of sacrifice rather than betrayal. Days later, when Grandma passed, the Sundays didn't disappear with her. They lingered. At the funeral, a man none of us recognized stood at a distance, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the casket. He didn't approach the family. He didn't speak. He simply watched, his face carrying a grief that felt too deep to be casual. Before leaving, he placed a small envelope near the flowers and walked away. Inside was a simple note thanking Eleanor for never abandoning him, even when the world had. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be one. In the months that followed, our family changed. Conversations grew more honest. Assumptions softened. The secret that had once threatened to break us instead became a reminder of how little we truly know about the people we love. Every Sunday now, at 3:10 p.m., I pause whatever I'm doing and think of Grandma walking down that narrow street, carrying envelopes and hope in equal measure. She vanished every Sunday for 20 years, and in doing so, taught us that love doesn't always look like presents. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice carried quietly through time.